I want to take a closer look at the wording of this passage. So he starts with telling us that he has all authority. He's basically using that um, to present that authority to who he's talking to, right? So when he says, "I have all authority," so because of that, you're going to go do this. He's giving those people authority, us authority to go and do this based off the authority God has given him. And so when we are calling people to discipleship, when we are discipling other people, when we're teaching other people, um, there is a certain aspect of that where we are acting with the authority of Christ as well as acting under the authority of Christ. That needs to be taken seriously, I think. But when we continue looking at what he says to make disciples of them, baptizing them, and then teaching them. And I think that we're gonna look a little bit heavier at this later on, but I think that this right here is gonna give us our method of discipleship. As far as understanding that getting somebody to believe in and following Jesus is not the end of our job. It's actually the beginning. And so often, that's kind of our end goal, right? Once you've accepted Christ, we'll baptize you, and sometimes we'll even pass that off. But we kind of call it quits after that, and from what Jesus is telling us in this passage, that's when the work first starts. We're charged again in John chapter 12, verse 26. It says, "If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him." And so in short, right, you don't have to follow Jesus. This is all a choice. Jesus doesn't even tell you have to follow him. But what he does say is if you want honor from God, then you'll follow him. That he's telling you that if this is what you want, this is how you get it. And we need to present that same argument when we're teaching other people about Christ. This isn't about, do you know where you're going when you die? This is about, there is a God in heaven. And if you want that God to look at you with favor, this is how you do it. And that's all evangelism really amounts to. See the same kind of message again in a different way in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1. And Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." That's a lot different than when we look at Jesus' words and we make that a little oversimplified sometimes. But I think that this is kind of eye-opening, and if it's not, it should be. It tells us a lot. First, it tells us who we have to be imitating. It tells us that bringing about disciples of other people serves us no purpose if we're not already imitating Christ. It argues that the weight of imitating Christ not only falls on the people who are seeking, but also the people who are teaching. The same weight falls on each of our shoulders in turn. And third, I think once again we see a method in all of this. We see how we disciple others. And I want you guys to be seeing that as we go through our passages, so that when we get to talking about how we disciple others, you guys are already well aware of where we're headed. Okay? To start with, I want to talk about what a disciple is, and I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary for this. Merriam-Webster defines a disciple as a follower, an adherent, a disciple, a partisan, mean one who gives full loyalty and support to another. Follower may apply to people who attach themselves either to the person or beliefs of another. An evangelist and his followers, adherent suggests a close and persistent attachment. Now that's quite a mouthful for a definition, but I think it was important to use this one. The Oxford Dictionary gave a much shorter one, but I chose this one because I think it gives a pretty full picture of what we're looking at. Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. And he called them, and immediately they left their boats and their father and followed him. So this passage, obviously, it's pretty easy to tell Jesus is calling his first disciples in this passage. But really what I want to focus on is what we're called to do when we follow Jesus. Because so often we act as if this is no big deal, right? You choose Jesus, Jesus fixes your life, everything is sunshine and rainbows from there. And really, Jesus never really blesses people without some kind of a charge or a call or a responsibility, right? And just getting back in that concept of obedience. So for these gentlemen, they're not just putting down that day's catch or that day's wages. They're not just making the job harder on their father, which most of us would argue would be a terrible son thing to do, right? And yet, Jesus' argument is you're going to have to give all of this up. And when he says fishers of men, understand this is more than just put this aside. I am going to change everything. I'm going to change your entire career. I'm going to change your job. I'm going to change your goal and your lifestyle, right? So when we're called to follow Jesus, he very rarely makes it some kind of cheap choice. He almost never calls somebody to him and then allows it to cost them nothing. More often, it's going to call us to give up everything we know and change everything we know. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking to somebody like me who comes to an understanding of the gospel later in life, or if you're talking about somebody like, Brother Dave, who grew up in the church. It doesn't matter. When you choose to follow Jesus, you give up a lot more than I think most people realize. And I think that most people don't realize how much Jesus is calling them to give up because they haven't really dedicated themselves to the call. When we follow Jesus, he becomes an all-encompassing thing. There's no aspect of our life that's removed from that. Right? It doesn't matter whether you're looking at how you perform at work, or how you talk to people you don't like, or how you deal with family, or how you deal with the annoying guy that lives next door to you. It doesn't matter what aspect of your life you're looking at, Jesus being present is supposed to change it. When you follow Christ, Christ becomes your example in every single situation. And so often we try to withhold certain ones. Even the people that are very clear and adamant that they've dedicated their whole lives to Jesus, there's so often you'll find some of these people have withheld a portion of their lives. Now here's the really important thing. And this kind of goes into even how we understand money. Right? I remember being taught the value of $1. And I don't know how this worked for all of you, but the way I was taught was to think about how much you made and how much it cost and look at it from an aspect of how long you had to work to earn that. And so if I make $10 an hour and I want to go to McDonald's and get, a decent meal and it's going to cost me $10, to not just look at the $10 bill, but to think about the fact that I just had to work an hour to eat what is usually a subpar sandwich. All right. The point of this is that's how we learn to value our money. Because $100 to me isn't going to be the same as $100 to a homeless person or $100 to somebody who has billions of dollars in a bank account. Right? How we see that number is going to change. When we're looking at Jesus, when we're looking at the idea of following Jesus, dedicating our life to Jesus, we have the same kind of concept. It has value because of the investment. And there's so many people that don't value Christ, don't value this discipleship that they claim to be a part of because they've not actually invested anything into it. Does that make sense? I know this is kind of me going on a tangent, and I do want to make it clear. I would like you guys to speak up if you have something to say. For this one, I don't really have a whole lot of questions because it's kind of the intro lesson. But if you do have something to say, please just make it known so that I can take a break and call on you. But it is something we need to be aware of in our own lives. And the point is, as we begin to look at the idea of making disciples of other people, this is going to become more and more important because, as we already looked at, that is a useless endeavor if you yourself are not in it. If you yourself are not properly discipled, you going out and attempting to make a disciple of somebody else is doing no one any good. You teaching people about Christ means nothing if you're not dedicated to Christ. Teaching people to give up the sin in their lives and choose to follow Jesus means nothing if you're living a life of sin. Right? It's that idea of a preacher is going to go to the club to evangelize. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense because in order for me to teach you about Jesus in that environment, I had to go there in the first place. Does that make sense? Go ahead, Dave.
Rudy used the word a couple of weeks ago in his class about an academic mindset.
Uh-huh.
And I may be misrepresenting it. It's coming to mind now with what you're saying. That academically, I can open this Bible and teach you what it says. But if I'm not living it, then
Sure.
that example, it's a useless endeavor. It's an academic.
Yeah, let me, okay, so everyone here learned about the Revolutionary War in school, right? Okay. Well, I'm just asking, it doesn't make any sense if I use this story and you're like, well, I didn't learn about that either. So you think about the Revolutionary, nobody here was alive during the Revolutionary War. And if I asked you to talk about the Revolutionary War, chances are you really don't have any feeling about it. Other than it was kind of the beginning of our nation. And you certainly might have some patriotic feelings on that. But in general, you have no emotional tie to the Revolutionary War. And yet you know a decent bit about it. Now, I'm getting to a point. Fast forward, and I talk about if I bring up 9/11. Do you feel the same way? Now, most of the people in this room remember 9/11. And do you feel the same way emotionally when I talk about the Revolutionary War that you do talking about September 11th? Why is that? Because it's a part of your life. It directly affected you. You have a certain emotional investment in that event. You have no emotional investment in the Revolutionary War. So you don't feel any kind of way about it because it's just a historical fact that you learned from a book. And we can often be the same way towards our Bibles, where we treat it like it's just a historical academic fact, but we have no real emotional investment into it. And what that ends up with is a guy who knows every word found in the book and can tell you what it says about any given subject, but there's no obedience. There's no sacrifice. And that's the real difference. I would much rather go out and work alongside somebody who really understands very little about Scripture, but has dedicated their life to it, than I would going out with somebody who knows every single thing in the Bible and has put no skin in the game. Does that make sense? And I think that God is very clear that He's going to smile on one over the other. Go ahead, Dave.
So from my standpoint, why we brought this for you to teach this discipleship is because we want that on our mind. We want to be thinking about it. If I want to keep my house with wood this year, I have to physically.
You got to put in the work, don't you?
And I have to think about when I have an opportunity to get into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so with discipleship, I want us to develop that same mindset.
Yeah.
That we need to bring in wood, for lack of a better analogy. And you have to think about how that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that's, hopefully by going, by studying this, presenting it, it puts it on our hearts and minds and starts pointing us to that direction.
Yeah. So kind of the way I'm trying to set all of this up is the first part of these classes is really going to be focused more on making sure that we are in fact disciples. And then later on we'll talk about sharing that with other people. But I wanted to start there because I do think that people overstate their own obedience to the Gospels. And that becomes very apparent to people when it's surface. And it doesn't, I can only tell you this from personal experience, that when people tried to talk to me about Jesus, it was very clear very quickly how invested they were in it. It was very clear very quickly whether this was somebody who really put everything they had into this and really believed what they were talking about, or if this was somebody yelling on a street corner because their church told them today we're going to do that. And there's a lot of times, Jace Campbell was not the first person to present the idea of being a Christian to me. He was the first effective person. And I can tell you it's because he was very genuine. And it was very clear that this mattered to him. And it was very clear that he had dedicated his life to it. It was very clear that was very clear to me very early on in our studies together. Whereas other people who had talked to me, you brush them off because it's very obvious right away that this person doesn't actually care all that much about what they're screaming about. And so that's why I want to focus on making sure that our disciples, our sense of being a disciple is solid. Because that's going to affect your abilities to teach other people how to be disciples. You can't teach what you don't know, right? So, just in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, the scripture Matthew says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth and said to him, "Follow me," and he rose and followed him. Now, and I think that this is even more of a powerful statement than the previous passage we looked at, right, where it was the fisherman being called. And the reason I say that is because Matthew is in a state where he is protected by Rome. And everyone he knows is Roman. And everyone who deals with him in any kind of positive way are all Romans. Right? Matthew is a Jew who's in a state where he's hated by Jews. Okay? And a Jew came and told him, you're going to put aside that life, which is a very cushy life. I mean, the tax collectors of Rome had it on easy street compared to any other citizen of Rome. Right? Because essentially I got to keep whatever I demanded you take, and I got guards to make sure you give me whatever I asked for, regardless of how much it is. Even if you know that Rome only asked for a day's worth of wages, I could still tell you I want 7, and my guards are going to come after you if you don't give it to me. Tax collectors had absolute power. And Matthew still has to give that up in order to follow Jesus. There's no you get to continue in this life. And understand, I don't necessarily think that this had anything to do with Jesus viewing tax collectors as evil, wicked people. Understand that Jews viewed people who collected taxes as evil, wicked people. But Jesus is going to look at the individual. You're not judged based on what you do. You're judged based on how you do it. And we have no indication that Matthew was any kind of dishonest tax collector. But it didn't matter to the Jews. And my point in all of this is, one does not walk away from service to Rome. Okay? He's not just giving up a cushy job with a high wage. He's giving up all of the protection that he has by being a Roman official to follow what is basically a homeless man. Go ahead, Dave.
And he hadn't died on the cross yet for sin.
Yeah, none of the evidence we have.
We look at that's a good thing when you get for it. That wasn't in play yet.
Yeah. And so the question that comes from all this is, right? So most of the people in this room will say that they've, decided to follow Jesus, that they've answered that call, that they've become disciples. My question to you is, what part of your life was sacrificed to make that choice?
Amen.
Go ahead, Sam.
The question I have, and I think I know the answer, man, why? Why did he give up his Christian job? Why did he walk away from all of it, follow a homeless man?
Well, I think that you'll find that when there are certain people, when they hear the call, are incapable of saying no to it. I'm not taking away from the idea of free will, but I believe that connection, that understanding of the Spirit, that communication can be as much of a spiritual gift as anything that God mentions in the Bible. And there are some people that are just, they hear Christ call for them and they answer. And they don't feel they have a choice in that. For some of us, we have to fight for that call.
I agree that's true. But I also believe that Jesus was becoming known because of John the Baptist.
Sure. There's every reason to believe that Matthew knew who this guy was. But as Dave points out, he still hadn't done any of the awesome things that we follow him for. This is in essence still just a religious teacher telling him to put aside his work and follow him. And that's huge. That's huge when most of us think that the only thing we have to sacrifice to follow Christ is a couple of hours on Sunday morning. That's really what all this boils down to, what we're getting at. Go ahead, Dave.
Sorry.
No, you're okay. This is what this is for.
We also see, as we progress through the study,
Mm-hmm.
we see disciples who didn't
Yeah.
leave the nest, didn't leave the tax collectors, but still were disciples of Jesus and had an integral part of getting the message out there. You think of Paul. When he went to Corinth, he worked for a while, but then Timothy came down, and he was able, because of the support of the disciples, the jobs that they had,
Mm-hmm.
that he could go out and teach. And I guess in our world today, we kind of do that. We have jobs, and we
Sure.
support you and missionaries, and a lot of work that is going on for the kingdom. So this idea that we have to quit our job.
Yeah. Understand, I'm not suggesting that the sacrifice you've been called to is not always going to look like the sacrifice these men have been called to. My argument isn't that your sacrifice looks like theirs. My argument is there's always a sacrifice. There's always something you have to give up. So I appreciate you bringing that up and making that a point, because I probably didn't relay that very well. And I don't want any of you guys to leave here thinking that, Nathan told me I have to quit my job and hopefully I can make it. All right, don't quit your job unless your job is one that is very clearly against God's word. So in all of this, I guess what we're really getting to is how much skin do you have in this? What is your investment in all of this? I part of getting ready for this Bible study, I've read several books on discipleship, and one of them I've really enjoyed is it's called The Cost of Discipleship, and it's written by a German Lutheran who I can't pronounce the name of, so I'm not going to attempt that. But if you're interested, I will relay that to you guys at some point. So in that book, he talks about this kind of same idea of sacrifice being necessary to follow Jesus. And one of the things he talks about is, while we don't preach or teach apostolic poverty, right, which is to say, I'm not telling you that you have to live in poverty in order to follow Jesus, you should not be living the life of your dreams and following Jesus. There should be enough of a sacrifice that there are some things in life you have to give up in order to maintain it. Meaning, sometimes I'm going to have to say, I can't eat out today because I have somebody that needs my help, and that money has to go towards that, and that's more important. That kind of understanding aspect. And his argument is, if you are living the life of your dreams, right, and you buy everything you want in life, everything you desire, you've been able to put that money towards, if you can do that, chances are you're not really giving a whole lot up to follow Jesus. And it goes so much further than money. If you have all the time in the world to do everything you could possibly want to do in life, chances are you're not doing a whole lot for the kingdom. Now, I think that this is especially true when we look at a concept that Dave has brought up several times during our men's study, in that men of my generation have a very different goal in life than men of most of your generation, in that we tend to value experience over objects, right? So owning a four-wheeler would be cool, but it's not really a goal I'm going to put a whole lot of effort into, if that makes sense. But going to another country and experiencing another culture, that's something I would work for. But the thing is, the point in this is, if I have the time to do all of this world traveling that I dream of doing, and being able to have all these experiences that I want to get out of life, chances are I'm not giving a whole lot of time for service. It's something for you to consider as we continue talking about discipleship. Ask yourself this over and over. What am I sacrificing for this call? Part of that definition we looked at from Merriam-Webster mentioned giving your full loyalty. And so Luke 22:33 comes up to talk about this. Peter said to him, Lord, I am ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. Now we know that the story is that Jesus informs him, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter ends up denying him 3 times. So clearly these words mean a lot less than he felt they meant at the time. But when you say that Jesus is my Lord, when you confess Jesus as Christ before your fellow man, does this thought come into your mind? Just how far are you willing to go? And for some of us, the idea of going to prison, I'll be honest, if somebody told me I had to go to prison for Jesus, it'd be hard, but It'd be a lot easier than it would be for some of you. You willing to die for him?
Ultimately, he did go through a prison and to death.
Eventually.
But he had to take a stutter step to get
Yeah, eventually. He had some hiccups along the way. But the question is, how dedicated are you? And how dedicated do you expect other people to be?
His view of what was going to happen that night
Mm-hmm.
was turned completely on its head. And
Yeah.
I always believed that that's the number one reason that he walked away. It wasn't that he was leaving, it was just he didn't know what he was supposed to do at this point. And he just denied it.
Sure. I mean, you look at Peter's mentality before that, up until that point, and his response is, well, I'm going to defend Jesus with my sword. But what are you going to do when Jesus is controlled by the Romans?
He had no interest in his defense.
Yeah.
He just didn't know what to do. I understand it. I sympathize with it. I hate to say I'd probably be right there with it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. But the point I'm making in this is the loyalty he expresses. Not the fact that he failed, but that he expressed this kind of loyalty, and that this kind of loyalty is the same kind of loyalty that each one of us is supposed to be expressing to Christ. And so I ask again, the question I have for us that we need to be asking ourselves is, how dedicated am I? How far will I go for this? And how far do I expect other people to go? Because some of us are willing to go as far as the church doors, but we're expecting other people to give up their lives. And if you fall into that category, you are not going to be effective at making disciples of other people. Because all they're going to see is you demanding a dedication to this cause that you yourself have not given. And so with that this morning, and I know that this is a shorter class, and that's quite all right, because the lesson will not be so today. I promised to keep it under 30 minutes, and I'm going to try my best to do that. But the point in all of this is to get you thinking about your discipleship, right? Before we can ever start looking at teaching other people about Jesus and teaching what their lives are supposed to look like and teaching what Jesus can do for them, you have to assess how much of that truth is applicable and visible in your life, and that is key. It can't just be, I say in my heart that I'm all in. If other people can look at my life and it does not look like I'm all in, then me telling them that they got to be that way is not only not going to be effective in kingdom work, but it's going to be counterproductive. Because those people are just going to assume that you're a hypocrite and that you're not worth listening to. Is there any other questions this morning or comments or anything like that anyone has? All right. So next week, I won't be here. I've got Andrew's wedding in Arkansas. I believe, Rudy, are you preaching next Sunday? Yeah. So for those of you that are sick of hearing me preach for a while, you're in luck. You get a little bit of vacation. But remember, next weekend is also our Thanksgiving. So I hope that you come to those things. I hope that you come to hear the message Rudy brings. But I will not be here next Sunday. The Sunday after that, we're going to start talking about the method of discipleship. And understand that we're going to be looking at all of these topics twice. This is not the last time we'll be talking about the call to discipleship. But the first time we look at each topic, we're going to be talking about how it relates to us, those of us who are already in this, those of us who already call ourselves Christians. And the second time we look at it, we're going to be talking about how do we teach this to other people. So I hope that you guys stay involved, stay listening. If you miss it, remember all of our sermons, all of our lessons will be posted on our website and on YouTube. So if you can't make it to church, you can still log in and hear the message that we're bringing that week. Thank you, guys.